Welcome back. We're talking about Afghanistan's rocky road towards democracy. And let's get back to our panel. I know before we went to the break, you had an observation you wanted to share, Ambassador.
I just want to quickly say that, yes, I fully agree that we need to reform the system. The system has to build trust and reconnect with the people and the trust that they have to have in the system. But at the same time, what I saw over the last few weeks in Afghanistan, which was very interesting, is that they were not all talking about banalities. They were also talking about real issues. Three things that came up constantly, especially with the reformists and the younger candidates, were how to fight poverty and create new livelihoods and new opportunities for the Afghans. Number two, anti-corruption, and how to fight corruption, because everyone is very much tired of this level of corruption that has taken over. And number three was accountability from all sides. Obviously, there was a lot of talk about peace, how to make peace, and under what conditions to make peace. Because Afghans are somewhat wary about what the next steps will be with the peace process and making sure that, as I said earlier, they do not throw away all the gains they've had.
Kamran, let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the things that has really been focused on, the young faces, women running for parliament, there seems to be this optimism about that. Is that a good, correct assessment?
I think it is, and I think that that is what the Taliban are worried about, and that is why they are targeting the election, because the Taliban are a relic of a time period when Afghanistan was just coming out of many years of civil war, and it was easy for them to sort of exploit the anarchy. Now, since 2002, there's been a tremendous amount of progress made, which the ambassador has mentioned, and I agree with him that those gains can't be lost. And we need to build upon them. The only way to build upon them is to keep the youth engaged in this process with that hope alive that, look, if you're going to run for office, you're going to make a difference. It may not be huge, but you will make a difference over time. And that's what is on the minds of the Taliban commanders, is that the population of the country is sort of slipping out of their sort of orbit, because that whole idea of we'll provide security with brute force and whatnot is not what this generation, with this post 9/11 generation in Afghanistan that's come of age, is willing to accept. They look for a different Afghanistan, and I think that's where the hope is for the rest of the international community, that the efforts that the international community put in since 2002 are going to lead somewhere. And again, I'm going to say, we keep talking about Afghanistan in sort of short term. We really need to have patience. And obviously you need to transfer more and more responsibility to the Afghan government and let it mature. And that's why it's going to be tricky. Negotiations with the Taliban, maturation of the Afghan political system, they're going parallel. And we don't want the negotiations with the Taliban to impact the gains that have been made.
Michael, let's talk a little bit about the security aspect of this, because you alluded to it. Of course, we're just learning that General Jeffrey Smiley, a brigadier general, was wounded in this attack on Thursday. Of course, the leader of the U.S. forces there was able to escape this attack. But Cameron's talking about maturation, bringing this country along, and yet I think here in the United States, there's a growing level of frustration with this war. When's it going to end? I mean, when is the U.S. troop presence going to end? Is it going to go on forever? I think one thing that you would say that Barack Obama and Donald Trump, they don't agree on much, but Afghanistan is probably one of them. They both wanted to get out. Where do you see the U.S. strategy going moving forward?
Well, I think you're right about the frustration. I don't think it's one that dominates American politics. You don't hear that much talk about Afghanistan. Even in defense policy, we're talking much more about Russia and China and North Korea and Iran. And so Afghanistan is really, not in the top 5 of our biggest concerns, and yet we have 15,000 troops in Afghanistan, and we're still spending $20 to $30 billion a year on the conflict. So on the one hand, it's sort of seen as a tolerable but ongoing wound or cost. On the other hand, there's a sense that it's been 17 years and it's not getting better. In fact, it's probably still gradually getting a little bit worse, even with the Trump buildup of the last year, which I had hoped might actually help shift the momentum slightly in the government's favor. Certainly no one expected miracles from a grand total of 15,000 U.S. troops and 20,000 NATO troops when we had well over 100,000 6 or 8 years ago, and certainly did not manage to win the war then. But there was some hope that tougher and more lenient rules of engagement, what I mean is, just more willingness, more ability to use air power and so forth in support of Afghan troops, combined with the additional American advisors in the field, that this would send a strong message to Afghan forces. They'd get confidence, they'd get more help. The Taliban would take note that we were not going away. The Pakistanis would take note, and this would begin to shift the momentum more in the favor of the government. I don't think that's happened, at least not yet, and I'm not really sure that it will.
So, Michael, if the White House issued an invitation, said, come on over, give us some advice, what do you think the next best move would be?
For the first time in many years, I don't know that I'm passionate about what that advice should be. I feel that I supported the Trump buildup last year because I thought that President Obama had sort of skipped a step in the way in which American and NATO forces were mentoring the Afghans in the field. Now we've gone back to that step, and I think it's potentially going to make some headway. But, I think maybe the only way to rethink this problem right now is to focus in bigger terms on Pakistan and see if we can talk with Pakistan in a way like we're talking with North Korea. Try to get them to see a bigger, bolder, bigger, better future if we can somehow deal with our disagreements in their support for the Taliban. And maybe start talking about the possibility of free trade agreements, other kinds of dramatic improvements in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, but conditioned on their willingness to really shut down the Taliban using their territory as sanctuary. Maybe that's the only big idea that I can really advance at this juncture, because I, too, am somewhat discouraged and frustrated.
Okay, he's throwing out a big idea, Ambassador. Would that work?
Yeah, well, I mean, frustration has existed for a while. I think that the worst case scenario would be to disengage prematurely and to not finish the job. We saw what happened in the 1990s. I don't want to repeat that. We know that Afghanistan is surrounded by some very dangerous elements. There are at least 20 different terrorist organizations in that region that are active and looking for that vacuum, that moment when they can step into a vacuum that is left behind. As far as the Taliban are concerned, we still are waiting to see what exactly is it that they want. They obviously they're fighting. They're talking about the emirate. They're talking about Sharia, this and that. But at the end of the day, politically speaking, what is it that they want and what is it that is acceptable? But we also know that Pakistan plays an important role, as Michael O'Hanlon said. Pakistan is going to be pivotal in terms of trying to understand what the future should look like. We know what they're doing. We want them to realize that there are options about the future and what kind of future this region should have. Now, quickly, we talked about strategy. He mentioned Russia, China, Iran. Okay, so these are neighbors of Afghanistan, basically, more or less. And so this is another reason why Afghanistan matters.
Kamran, what are your thoughts? Pakistan, is that the secret recipe here? Work with them to try and achieve what Michael was just outlining?
I think I agree, broadly speaking, with what Michael is saying. That is something that has not been tried. And I would add to what Michael is saying is that right now the Pakistanis are under a lot of domestic economic and financial pressure. They're going to the IMF for $12 billion to essentially bail out a very bad situation, bail themselves out of it. I think it's the time, to what Michael was saying, is that let's talk to them, say, okay, how can we incentivize them to see the things the way Washington is looking at it, and look at it from, not just, okay, we're supporting the Taliban and, we're going to use that as a card. But we need to be mindful that I think that what is not being discussed is just how much control does the Pakistani state actually have over the Taliban.
And what's your sense?
My sense is that the monopoly that Islamabad had over the Taliban has withered away to a point where non-state actors within Pakistan are sharing that with the state. And this has happened over a period of 10, 15 years. And I think that it's not going to be, oh, let's knock on Pakistani door and then they'll come in. There has to be some homework by the Pakistanis to make sure that everybody in their country is playing ball. I'm talking, former military officers, former intelligence people for whom this is a political economy. And then there are, of course, groups that think like the Taliban, and there are plenty of them in Pakistan that need to be also accounted for. And we can't do that sitting here in Washington. That's what the Pakistanis will have to do. And I think that's what we need the Pakistanis to actually start working on sooner rather than later.
Just to say, today there were reports that the Pakistanis released the number 2 of the Taliban, Mullah Baradar. It has to be confirmed. He has been incarcerated for the past few years. This is the level of engagement that the Pakistanis have with the Taliban.
Nafay, we'll leave the last question to you. David Loyne came out with a book about Afghanistan, and he talked about all the great powers. They all come in. You look at the British Empire, they come in, they leave. You look at the Soviet Union, they come in, they leave. His assumption that the U.S. will leave at some point. What's the answer? I mean, how do you turn this thing around? And obviously the Taliban is a piece at this. How do you get them to the peace table and to peace talks and come up with a solution?
Well, it's a very good question, and one that's been perplexing policymakers for the past 17 years. And I don't think we'll come up with a very strong suggestion at this point, but I think it's important to realize that any solution will have to involve the Afghan government and the Taliban, and they really have to both be on board. And I think the U.S. will play a role in it, but they won't be at the front seat. I think it does have to include better legitimacy in terms of the government being able to control its own corruption, getting its own people behind it as a government force, and then including slowly the Taliban and other insurgent groups into the process. I do agree with Kamran that this will be a long process, and so we're going to come across a lot of roadblocks along the way. But it is one that steadily has to be trodden.
Well, we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much. Great panel. Thanks for the discussion. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. The conversation, though, continues online. Join us on CGTN's America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.